The words, "You're no longer our daughter," hit me like ice water as I stood in our family living room, still holding the acceptance letter to graduate school that I'd been so excited to share. My mother's face was stone cold, my father's arms crossed like a fortress wall. The scholarship letter, full ride to study environmental law, suddenly felt weightless in my trembling hands. My name is Rachel. I'm 23, and this is the story of how I discovered my true worth when my family tried to erase it. The living room where I'd opened Christmas presents, where I'd studied for the LSAT, where I'd celebrated getting into law school just 3 months earlier, suddenly felt like a courtroom where I'd already been convicted. The reason? I'd chosen environmental law over corporate law. I'd chosen a path that didn't fit their vision of prestige and profit. "Pack your things," my father said, his voice carrying that executive tone that had intimidated business rivals for decades. "If you won't represent the family interests, you can't live under our roof." My younger brother Marcus shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his eyes darting between me and our parents. My sister Victoria examined her manicure, seemingly bored by the drama unfolding. Neither said a word, as I was essentially excommunicated from the family that had raised me to believe love came with conditions. That night, I moved into a studio apartment across town, my belongings fitting into my old Honda Civic in just 2 trips. I had saved enough from my part-time job at the legal clinic to cover the security deposit and first month's rent. The silence from my family was deafening. No calls, no texts, nothing. For 3 weeks, I lived in that strange bubble of grief and newfound independence, working at a legal aid clinic during the day and studying at night. Then everything changed. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The caller ID showed our family attorney's number, something that had never happened before. When I answered, his voice was urgent, almost panicked. "Rachel, I need you to come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. There's been a development with your grandfather's estate that requires immediate attention." My grandfather, my mother's father, had died 2 years earlier. I'd been told the estate was settled, everything distributed. What could possibly require my attention now? The next morning at 9 a.m., sitting across from Mr. Patterson in his mahogany-paneled office, I learned the truth that would change everything. The documents he spread across his desk revealed a secret my parents had kept hidden. My grandfather had established a massive trust fund specifically in my name, triggered to activate when I turned 23. "Your grandfather was very specific," Mr. Patterson explained, his glasses reflecting the morning light. "The trust was designed to support your education and early career, particularly if you chose to pursue public interest law. He believed you had the character to use wealth responsibly for social good." The amount made my head spin. $2.8 million plus the deed to his lake house and a portfolio of environmentally responsible investments. But here's where it got interesting, and where my parents' calculation had backfired spectacularly. The trust contained a clause that any attempt by family members to coerce or manipulate my career choices would result in additional penalties against the main family estate. My grandfather, it seemed, had anticipated exactly what my parents had done. "There's more," Mr. Patterson continued, pulling out another folder. "Your parents have been using power of attorney to manage certain aspects of your grandfather's remaining assets. But with this trust activating and given their recent actions toward you, there are some serious legal complications." As he explained the details, I realized my parents hadn't just disowned me. They'd unknowingly triggered a legal chain reaction that put their own financial stability at risk. My grandfather had built protections into his estate that would punish anyone who tried to control or exclude me from the family. I walked out of that office in a daze, my mind reeling with possibilities. For 3 weeks, I'd been the rejected daughter, scraping together rent money and eating ramen noodles. Now, I was financially independent with more resources than I'd ever imagined. But more than the money, I had something else: leverage. That evening, I sat in my tiny studio apartment, looking at the bank statements Mr. Patterson had given me. My phone had been buzzing all day, missed calls from my mother, my father, even Marcus. They knew. Somehow, they'd found out about the trust. As I later learned, Mr. Patterson was legally required to notify all parties affected by the estate complications, including my parents, as holders of the power of attorney, which he did immediately after our meeting. I didn't call them back. Instead, I made a different call, to the admissions office at Stanford, where I'd been accepted to their environmental law program but had deferred due to family circumstances. With my grandfather's trust fund, I could now afford not just tuition, but the freedom to pursue exactly the career path my parents had rejected. 3 days later, on Friday afternoon, my mother finally appeared at my apartment door. I saw her through the peephole. Designer clothes, perfect hair, but something desperate in her posture. When I opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered. "Rachel, sweetheart," she said, trying to smile, "we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." I leaned against the door frame, not inviting her in. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "About your career choice, about the things we said. We were just concerned about your future security." "Concerned enough to disown me?" Her composure cracked slightly. "We never meant it permanently. Families have disagreements, but right now there are some legal matters involving your grandfather's estate that need your signature." And there it was, the real reason for her visit. Not love, not reconciliation, but paperwork that required my cooperation. "I see," I said quietly. "So when you told me I was no longer your daughter, that was just a temporary business decision." She flinched. "Rachel, please. This is complicated. Your father's business partners are asking questions about the estate. If we don't resolve this quickly, it could affect everyone." I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in our relationship, I held the cards. My mother, who had never asked for anything, who had always given orders, was standing at my door, asking for help. "I'll think about it," I said, and gently closed the door. Over the following week, the calls intensified. My father left voicemails explaining the financial complications in increasingly urgent tones. Marcus texted me asking if we could meet for coffee. Even Victoria, who hadn't spoken to me since the disowning, sent a message suggesting we needed to work together as a family. Through Mr. Patterson, whom I called to get clarity on the situation, I learned more about my parents' situation. My grandfather's estate had been more complex than they'd realized, with multiple conditions and triggers built in. My disowning had activated several penalty clauses that were now threatening their access to funds they'd been counting on for my father's business expansion. The irony was perfect. By rejecting me for choosing public service over profit, they'd triggered the very consequences my grandfather had designed to protect that choice. 2 weeks later, in early May, I agreed to meet with them, but on my terms, in Mr. Patterson's office, with full legal representation. The family that had banished me from our living room was now sitting across a conference table, needing my signature to save their financial future. My father looked older, stress lines etched around his eyes. My mother kept glancing at her phone as if expecting urgent news. Marcus and Victoria flanked them like nervous bodyguards. "Rachel," my father began, his executive voice now tinged with something I'd never heard before: vulnerability. "We made mistakes. We let our concern for your future cloud our judgment." I sat back in the leather chair, Mr. Patterson beside me, and waited. "The family business is facing some challenges," he continued. "Challenges that could be resolved if we can properly execute your grandfather's estate plan. But that requires your cooperation." My mother leaned forward. "We're prepared to support your law school plans. Stanford is an excellent choice. We could even help with living expenses." The offer that would have meant everything to me a month ago now felt hollow. They weren't offering support. They were offering payment for my signature. "I appreciate the offer," I said quietly, "but I've already arranged my own financing." The room fell silent. Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment. Marcus looked genuinely confused. "Your own financing?" my father asked. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should explain the full scope of the trust fund to everyone." As he detailed my grandfather's provisions, the $2.8 million, the investments, the lake house, and most importantly, the protective clauses that penalized anyone who tried to control my career, I watched my parents' faces change: shock, recognition, and finally something that looked almost like fear. "So you see," I said when Mr. Patterson finished, I don't need your support for law school. I don't need your permission to pursue environmental law, and I certainly don't need your approval to live my life." My father's face reddened. "You can't just walk away from family obligations." "Family obligations?" I stood up, feeling steady and strong. "Like the obligation to love your children unconditionally? Like the obligation to support their dreams even when they don't match your own? Those family obligations?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. Whether real or calculated, I couldn't tell. "Rachel, please, we can work this out. We're still family." I gathered my papers and looked at each of them. These people who had shaped my childhood, who had given me life and love, and then tried to take it away when I didn't conform to their expectations. "You're right," I said. "We are still family." But family doesn't end when someone chooses a different path. You ended it when you decided love came with conditions. You ended it when you threw away your daughter rather than trust her judgment. I paused at the door, turning back one last time. "I'll sign the documents that properly execute grandfather's estate. But not because you need me to, because it's the right thing to do, and because grandfather trusted me to make the right choices. That's the difference between conditional love and unconditional character." 6 months later, by September, I was settled into my first semester at Stanford, living in a beautiful apartment near campus that I could afford thanks to my grandfather's foresight and love. I had signed all the necessary paperwork before leaving for California, resolving the legal complications with my parents' business. The lake house had become my retreat, where I studied environmental law surrounded by the natural beauty I was learning to protect. My parents' business survived the estate complications, though it required some downsizing and restructuring. The legal penalties were eventually resolved through the proper execution of the estate documents, allowing them to retain access to the funds they needed, albeit with the clear understanding that any future attempts to control my choices would trigger even more severe consequences. They sent me a graduation gift when I finished my first year, a card with a check I didn't need, and a note that said, "We're proud of you," that I'd waited my whole life to hear. But pride offered after rejection isn't the same as love offered freely. I kept the note, but I'd already learned something more valuable, that the most important approval I needed was my own. Our relationship today exists in a careful balance. We maintain cordial contact during holidays and major milestones, but the deep trust and unconditional love that should define a family was broken that day in our living room. They learned to respect my independence, and I learned to live without their approval. Marcus and I occasionally meet for coffee when I'm in town, though he still struggles with divided loyalties between his parents and his conscience. Victoria remains distant, having never fully understood why I couldn't just conform to keep the family peace. The rejection that was meant to control me had instead set me free. The family that tried to shrink my dreams had unknowingly provided me with the means to expand them beyond anything they could have imagined, and the grandfather who had believed in me long before I believed in myself had given me something more valuable than money. The knowledge that someone had seen my true worth and protected it, even from those who should have cherished it most. Today, I'm working on cases that matter, fighting for the environment my grandfather loved, living a life he would have been proud of. And sometimes, when I'm at the lake house watching the sunset over water that belongs to me, I whisper thank you to the man who knew that true family doesn't abandon you when you disappoint them. True family gives you the tools to disappoint them and still succeed. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles. Zero cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.